And the name comes into Arabic, ilmaniyya. Ilmaniyya means secularism. This new word pops in. And the idea was to make the sacred and the profane, the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. You see how they brought this Christian filth into this religion of ours and divided it to make people say, okay, when it has to do with commercial law, renting, buying, selling, that's the matters of the profane. But when it has to do with sacred matters, prayer and wudu and whether or not to uppercut your wife or not, and all these other issues, well, that has to do with the sacred law. And you'll see people today, buffoons, calling the revealed law sacred law, and this is secular law, and making these definitive splits between the law, when in actuality it was always referred to as the revealed law. It was always referred to as the heavenly law. But they began to make these divisions. And by doing so, they were able to build up secular courts that would deal with all practical cases. Serbian nationalism was fanned in what would later become the synthetic country called Yugoslavia. Now, look at what happened. In the country that later became Yugoslavia, the Western powers, the Franks, if you will, the Franj, began to tell the Albanians, we're confiscating the lands that are yours, and we're giving them to these Serbian people. To which the Albanian response was, you can't do that, this is our property. No, we're handing it over. And so Serbian nationalism began to flower because they were shown that these are yours now, we've given them to you. And the flames of nationalism began to be fanned, where they were told, it's not important whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish. What's important is that you're all Yugoslavs, you're all Serbs, you're all whatever the case be that they're making mention of. And nationalism begins to be fanned. And the pieces that were holding these nations together because of religious identity began to loosen. And people who look the same but have been told that they're different start to kill people that look the same way as them because they've been told, because of the language that they speak, that they are either better or worse than other people. And this is the beginnings of nationalism. Qawmiyya, Asabiyya, Arabiyya, all these words for nationalism in Arabic. This is precisely what happened. And it spread. It spread. The Panama Canal was completed in 1332, but the native people were not allowed to take full advantage of it, although they built the entire thing as slave labor. So the Latino people were enslaved, and the Panamanian people were not allowed to use this massive canal that would be used by the United States. Just as an update, they were told that the canal would be returned to them in 1997. In 1996, the United States invaded Panama using some of its fresh laser technology on the Panamanian people and on their administrative infrastructure. They devastated the country so badly, when 1997 came, they said, well, obviously you're in no condition to be custodians over and oversee the Panama Canal. It looks like we're going to have to hold on to it for another 20 years while you rebuild. A very good documentary on this is called The Panama Disaster, which actually headlines. You can see pictures of cars that have been lasered in half, right? The face of a man on the ground, spread out like how a diaper would be. You can see all these horrible things that were done to keep control over a people. Now, between 1332 and 1336, the first European Civil War occurred. I know that in English you've been told this is World War I. But my question is, how is it called World War I when all of the people that are fighting and fighting each other are French or Franks, and they're using other countries as a backyard? That's not a war. Were the Tongans in World War I? Were there Samoans on the battlefield in World War I? Where were the Afghani fighter pilots? Where were the Punjabi Panzer tank divisions? There weren't any. And the reason why there weren't any is because it wasn't a world war. And you'll look in a lot of the books in Arabic. I've merely just brought it in for you just for the barakah of having it. In Arabic, they call these the European civil wars, because this is all that it was. Europeans got into a dispute after the Berlin Conference over further expansion into new territories, to where the Germans were expanding into the area that they were destroying as they began to annihilate Turkish peoples further to the east. They were intent on taking those areas. And the British said, no, we're taking them. And there was a massive dispute. Now, what they sometimes tell you is, well, it had to do with the assassination of the Archduke of... Listen, that assassination, whether there were 10 archdukes or whether it was the rapping duke, it wouldn't have mattered who got killed. What mattered more importantly was the dispute on territory and natural resources. That was the massive dispute. And it led to the European Civil War, which was the first time trench warfare was used on a global scale among European powers. The powers fell out over land promises regarding Africa, India, and Western Europe, because a lot of people wanted India because of oil, agates, rubies, and diamonds. And by using India as a supply line, people wanted to run a pipeline from India across over into Iraq, which had recently been created out of another set of countries. A European socialite had drawn a picture of what she thought Iraq should look like on a map for her husband, who was an ambassador, and this became Iraq in 1920. Never mind what the Hashemiya royal family thought. They don't matter in this thing. We've made a new country, and they made another country called Iran. They made a subsection of Iraq called Granj, which was later renamed Kuwait because it was named after an advisor that was there. So that people are just making maps and drawing boundaries. And it's curious because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Allah has cursed the one who redraws the boundaries of a land without the permission of its owner. That hadith is in Sahih al-Jami'. Look at all of what happened. World War I and just before was all about redrawing maps and redefining peoples, and people that hadn't fought before were now fighting because their house became a border with someone else's, and hey, you're from Sudan, oh, well, I'm Egyptian now, and the battle began. And this is how problems started. So, these countries go to war, destroy one another, and use the backyards of other countries as depots, weapon storages, places where they're going to keep their weapons, cable cars stacked with weapons. Now, to let you know that this is still going on, some of you at night, if you live near to train tracks, or you live near where trains pass by, every now and then, about once a week, you'll hear a train go by and it sounds really heavy, heavier than your normal tram or train, and it takes about, 10 minutes for it to finish passing until the caboose goes by? Those are what are called ammo dumps. Those trains are filled with ammunition, filled with bullets, filled with weapons, filled with munitions and armaments that are headed to the north of the United Kingdom to be shipped out to other countries. That's what you're hearing. Massive amounts of armaments. They have the same thing in the United States. Now, by the war's end, 37 million people had died in head-on fighting, trench warfare, and mustard gas attacks. Still more would head home for life, and they would be crippled, either by blindness or other sicknesses. One of those in a German unit on the way back home to the Weimar Republic was a young man by the name of Adolf Hitler. He had volunteered and fought in that First World War, was a decorated war soldier, won the Iron Cross First Class. He is the only German officer on record that we have that survived the killing fields of Flanders. So the man was most certainly not a coward. He was a despot, he was a tyrant, he was a criminal. But to get across the fields of Flanders and to survive the killing fields is the equivalent of meeting someone that survived one of the beachhead fronts in World War II, or came across in Normandy, or survived the Da Nang, the battle in Da Nang, or the Battle of Saigon. It was a time where If someone found out that you had fought in that war and you survived that particular theater or conflict, you were to be congratulated because it was a very difficult part of the war. He was hit with mustard gas, and all the way up to the end of his life, he always suffered from acute migraines, and his hand, when he would offer it, his left hand to people, his pinky finger, his smallest finger, would jut out because it was damaged in the attack. He thought he was going to be blind for life when he was shipped back to Germany. And when he had heard that after all the sacrifices they made, that they were losing the rest of the remnants of the monarchy, that they'd lost the war, and that Germany was being broken down into pieces, bite-sized pieces, by the other people that they just attended the Berlin conference with only years ago. They turned on them and were now biting into the heels and the back of Germany like a meal. Think about this. Remember, just a page ago, they were all at the Berlin conference together, weren't they, dividing up Africa? At the end of World War II, they're dividing up Germany, deciding that, yes, Germany's now going to pay for the entire European Civil War. They're going to pay for the whole of it, which cost billions of Deutschmarks. So there was no honor or agreements made between them that were honored. Now, as I mentioned, Hitler had been blinded by a mustard gas attack and received an Iron Cross for his bravery in being the only one to survive the killing fields of Flanders. Just 1 year before, in 1335, the Russian Revolution had occurred, and the last Tsar of the Russian monarchy was murdered along with his family. The Frankish countries were moving away from a Julian to a Gregorian calendar, and any countries colonized were given a 365-day gift, meaning their calendar. The calendar that is being used today, where you are continuously told it's 2010, it's 2009, it's 2008, is the Gregorian calendar promulgated by Pope Gregory to try to fix all the errors that occurred in the Julian calendar. And people sometimes think it's extreme, but I'm quite militant about using the Muslim calendar, because once someone decides when your days are and when your festivals are, they've got control over you. And that's always been a major concern of mine and other people. And as they started to go into the Muslim world, one of the things they did, in addition to just abolishing the revealed law, is they abolished calendars. You don't need to use this calendar anymore, except in Ramadan, when you'll have the Ramadan wars. And except on Eid, when you have the Eid skirmishes. But besides that, don't worry about this calendar. And you need to know, obviously, when the Rabi al-Awwal, the 12th is, because you need to know when Mawlid is. But besides that, you don't need to know, other than Mawlid, the two Eids, and Ramadan is for the Ramadan wars. You don't need to know anything else about this calendar. Be quiet. We've got it sorted. All you need to do is worry about, from January all the way to December, although they're named after pagan deities of Augustus and Januarius and deities of menstruation, deities of fornication and other things, you don't worry about that. Just use our calendar. That is precisely what happened. And today, even in the countries that class themselves as the torchbearers of Sharia, Saudis consider themselves the very bringers of Sharia, surrounded by grave worshippers and mushriks. But they still use the Gregorian calendar, because otherwise their computers won't work, and their ships won't fly, and their tanks won't work, and the planes that they bought that are 20 years old, they won't function. So they too are slaves to Pope Gregory. They've got a little bit of Catholic in them, in more ways than one. And some others have a little bit of Catholic in them, because they're enslaved by the same calendar. If someone tells you when your days are, when your date is, they've got control over you. Any more than someone controlling your moving and goings. And this is more sinister because you're being colonized in your mind. And not being colonized physically. You're being colonized in your mind. You're imprisoned in your mind. And that's worse than being in prison physically. Because you can still be free mentally, even though you're being tortured and beaten. But if you're colonized in your mind, how do you break out of that? How do you figure out that you've been colonized? And that's the horrible thing. That's the first horrible thing. 1337 brought the final phase of the Ottoman collapse. The revealed law was removed from the law books for any use altogether and replaced by a constitution with a guarantee of equal rights for all. As they began exterminating Turks and other undesirables moving forward to what is today Turkey. They were sweeping the Turks back towards Turkey in the hope to exterminate every single last one of them. 5,000 scholars killed in one day from one side of the Muslim world to the other.